Our third speaker is Daniel, who will tell us about peer effects from friends and strangers.
All right, thank you, Kevin. And thanks to the conference organizers for including this paper in the program. This is joint work with my PhD student, Wei Lu, who's on the marketing job market this year, so check him out. So this is a paper about individuals' decisions to adopt a new product. We know that there's a lot of factors that go into that decision. One important factor, given the context here, is the structure of their social network. In particular, we know that individuals tend to adopt a new product if they observe their friends adopt. This Bailey et al. Paper finds that if your friend on Facebook buys a new iPhone, in the following weeks, you're actually a lot more likely to buy a new iPhone yourself. So given these kinds of social interaction effects, it's no surprise that we gather social network data and use it for things like targeted advertising or counterfactual product seeding. But beyond friends, we know also that individuals tend to adopt a new product if they observe strangers adopt that product. So to make that concrete, I'll look at this Bollinger paper. So what they find is if you are living in suburban Connecticut and one of your neighbors about half a kilometer away puts solar panels on their roof, you're a lot more likely to put solar panels on your roof in the following months. Okay? So a stranger here is someone that you don't have an explicit social connection with, but you're still proximate to them. You can observe their adoption, and this adoption certainly affects your own propensity to adopt. So effects from these kinds of observed adoptions are a type of peer effect. They're not the only kind of peer effect, but they're the one that I'm going to talk about today. And we kind of have two questions in this project. One is to sort of synthesize these two friends and strangers literatures. If observing both types of social interaction or both types of adoptions matter, which source of social influence is more impactful? We want to think of that both the marginal effect as well as the cumulative effect. So marginal effect, interact with one more friend or one more stranger. What's the effect on the lift in adoption versus given all the friends and all the strangers you might interact with over time, which is going to be kind of a cumulatively more impactful on adoption. And the second question we want to answer, are peer effects from friends and strangers substitutes? So it's expensive to gather social network data. If you can kind of get all the heavy lifting done by relying on peer effects from strangers without gathering these kind of social network links, then maybe that's worthwhile in some contexts. So there's kind of a few challenges to dealing with or to answering these questions. First, just observing friends' interactions and stranger interactions in the same data set is quite rare. But second, conditional on observing those interactions with strangers, it's hard to say how exogenous those interactions really are. If you have two people who happen to be in the same place at the same time, and one of them adopts, and then soon after another adopts, well, that it's plausible that it's a peer effect, but it's also very plausible that these are correlated unobserved shocks between these two people that are both leading them to adopt at the same time. So we're going to use data from an online multiplayer game to kind of get around this correlated unobserved shocks problem. With this data, we're going to observe in-game social networks. We're going to observe in-game product adoptions, which are microtransactions. And we're also going to observe player interactions with strangers, which is going to be everyone who's not in your in-game social network. And importantly, what we can do in this context is leverage a matchmaking algorithm that brings people together in the game to play matches to isolate quasi-random variation in exposure to adoptions from strangers. So as you play the game, you're kind of thrown together with different groups of people, and we can kind of exploit that to identify peer effects. The preview of the results, strangers do matter quite a bit, as the literature finds, but friends tend to matter more, both on the margin and in terms of the cumulative effect. But the two sources of influence are partial substitutes, so we can kind of think about what this means for counterfactual product seeding strategies. Can seeding to sort of strangers, or seeding to people who would influence a lot of strangers because maybe they're very active in the network, could that do the heavy lifting of leading to greater diffusion? There's a lot of literature on this. Suffice to say, this paper has a niche in how it's looking at things. So the empirical setting is a video game called Dota 2. It's free to play. It's an online competitive multiplayer game. There's a lot of people who play it. There's a lot of matches played every day on average. So what is a match? You should think of this game as kind of being something like online chess. Maybe you're starting at a home screen, then you're choosing to play a match. In the match, you win it or you lose it after expending effort. After that, you're kicked back to the home screen. So in each match, you can choose one of 100 called heroes to play as, which each have their own strengths and weaknesses in the context of the match. So products in this context are cosmetic items that you purchase in-game that enhance in-match appearance. So there's no pay-to-win features in this game. There's nothing you can buy that gives you a competitive advantage. The game makes money solely from selling cosmetic items, which you purchase from the home screen and which will be equipped before you enter the match. So matches are going to be played in 2 teams of 5. You queue with up to 4 friends, but if you don't have a full team of 5, then the remaining teammates are going to be assigned by the matchmaking algorithm. Okay? And your opponents will also be assigned by the matchmaking algorithm. So the matchmaking algorithm, what it's trying to do is create fair games, games where both teams have an equal chance of winning. And so it's going to condition on skill level. So it's going to try to match teams of roughly equal skill. And it's going to condition on very broad geographic areas, like, say, North America, so that when you're playing the game, there's not a large lag time or latency in communicating to servers that are far away. But just conditioning on skill level and geography, there's nothing about whether or not people have cosmetics or not. That doesn't enter the matchmaking algorithm at all. So if we can condition on these things as well, this is kind of our identification strategy. Residual variation in exposure to adoptions is going to be random. So we start with about 100 million unique matches. We're going to focus on 6 cosmetic release waves in 2017 and 2018. Each release wave is going to release 8 kind of brand new hero-specific cosmetics. And we're going to choose a set of focal players based on whether they're using the heroes in the days leading up to that cosmetic release that are having a cosmetic in that release. So basically, we want players who, after the cosmetic release, will be able to observe them actually equip the cosmetic because they're playing the correct character that has that hero-specific cosmetic. Right? So all matches are played by, we're looking at all matches played by these focal players for 30 days post-release. It's going to give us about 400,000 unique matches. So the summary stats here are at the player release level. Our number of observations is larger than our number of focal players because some focal players are focal for multiple release waves. And what we see is, on average, in the 30 days after a cosmetic release, these guys play about 140 games. Purchasing the cosmetic, we could code as 0 or 1. So if you purchase any cosmetic from that particular release wave, that's a product adoption. About 65% of these guys do adopt by the end of these 30 days. On average, we'll have 8.5 interactions with strangers, with friends who've adopted the cosmetic. So you'll be in a match with friends who have the cosmetic equipped 8.5 times, and you'll be in about 9 matches with strangers who have the cosmetic equipped. Model is super simple because you can kind of think about this product. There's nothing strategic about the adoption here. There's no indirect or direct network effects. You're purely adopting based on your own utility. And so we can kind of just think about a stopping time or an optimal stopping model. And in the baseline specification, we're going to go the simplest route possible and just make it linear. So we're going to code someone as having adopted by match J as depending on a linear function of the cumulative number of friends you've interacted with who have adopted the product, who have equipped the cosmetic. And we'll take the log of that to allow for kind of a diminishing marginal effect, plus the cumulative number of interactions with strangers who adopted the product. We'll have some controls and some fixed effects as well. So what we're trying to identify here are delta 1 and delta 2, just these 2 parameters in this linear model. If the matchmaking algorithm was purely random, if it just threw people together without any kind of conditioning, then we wouldn't need really any other, we wouldn't need to say anything else about identification, right? Just including this number of strangers you interact with is going to be, it's going to be exogenous all on its own. But we know that this matchmaking algorithm conditions. So it conditions on skill and geography. We're going to assume that a player release level fixed effect is going to be sufficient to condition on those things. Intuitively, what we're saying here is a player's skill is not going to change too much in the 30 days after the cosmetic release, nor is their geographic region, right? And if those things are staying constant, then a fixed effect is perfect to soak that up, leaving kind of residual variation as quasi-random. For delta 1, it's a little bit trickier because you choose whether or not you're going to play with friends at any given match. So we're going to do kind of a few things that the literature has sort of put forward as best practice. If you know this literature, things like homophily and the reflection problem can be dealt with fairly straightforwardly by the fixed effect and lagged adoptions. In terms of correlated shocks, We do a few things which, in the interest of time, I won't talk about here, but I'm happy to talk about in questions or offline. All right, so first results, marginal effects. Preferred specification and cut of the data is column 6. So the marginal peer effect from friends, 1 log point increase in the cumulative number of encounters is going to lead to about a 0.02 increase in the propensity to adopt, whereas for strangers, it's going to be about 0.01. So you can think of friends have about double the marginal impact as strangers when you encounter them with the adopted product in terms of their effect on your own propensity to adopt. In terms of elasticities, these are kind of, reflecting that as well on the lower range of kind of what's been estimated in the literature for these peer effects from friends and strangers separately. Next exercise are peer effects from friends and strangers substitutes. Again, kind of leveraging the quasi-random variation, we can just throw an interaction effect between the number of interactions with friends and with strangers and check the coefficient on that term. Negative effect. So the more strangers you interact with, the smaller the marginal effect from a friend. The more friends you interact with who've adopted the product, the smaller the marginal impact from a stranger. That's not too surprising that there'd be kind of this diminishing marginal effect, especially if we imagine both types of peer effects operating through the same channel. But it's also not mechanical, which again, happy to talk through. So kind of given that we have peer effects from friends are much larger than peer effects from strangers, and that they are substitutes, natural question is, can we kind of understand this by exploring the mechanisms through which peer effects operate? So the main mechanism that I want to talk about today, and there's more in the paper, is increased awareness, right? The idea is I might not be aware that this cosmetic even exists, but once I encounter someone who has it equipped in Match, I become aware, it enters my consideration set, and now I'm obviously more likely to buy it than if I didn't know about it, okay? So to kind of test this awareness story, we're just going to think about whether first encounters are especially important, okay? So I'll introduce another term into the linear model of a dummy variable of a first encounter. Doesn't matter if it's with a friend or with a stranger, just is match J kind of the first encounter you have with this cosmetic, okay? And what we find is a large positive and precisely estimated delta 3. So that first encounter leads to a huge increase in the propensity to adopt. And what happens to the other types of peer effect? So for friends, delta 1 kind of remains positive and significant, although it decreases in size. Okay? So the marginal impact of friends goes down. For strangers, this coefficient shrinks to 0, and it's kind of a precisely estimated 0. So we basically have a story where perhaps awareness is the main channel for peer effects from strangers. You interact with a stranger, they make you aware of the product, but after that, there's nothing more to be gained from interacting with strangers. You can interact with more strangers, you're already aware of the product. It's not leading to any marginal increase in the propensity to adopt. Versus with friends, it seems like even after that first encounter, there is an increase in the marginal propensity to adopt. So the question is, why is that happening? So we test some additional stories. We find evidence against social learning, so it's not kind of like you're continuing to learn things from your friends' adoptions. We do find evidence that visibility really matters. If the cosmetic is more visible, then you're a lot more likely to experience an increase in your propensity to adopt. So kind of our conclusion here is there's something special about friends, perhaps just even some kind of mere exposure effect that's different from strangers, but that these two types of peer effects do both operate through the awareness channel. Okay, so then the last part of the paper, we want to think about the cumulative peer effects, right? So we want to know, in terms of like the cumulative effect on your propensity to adopt, are friends more important as they are in the marginal case, or do strangers become more important? Because you potentially are interacting with more strangers, and stranger peer effects could be the things that trigger friends to adopt, and then interacting with those friends, you can kind of ultimately attribute that peer effect to the initial stranger. So without going into it, we calibrate a model of group formation, so who you play a match with, and a model of gameplay, a super simple model of just choosing to play a game or not. And we model product adoption as well in our kind of simple linear way for the first release event for about 250,000 players. And when we kind of run this model, when we shut down sort of peer effects from friends, and we only allow pure effects from strangers to run, they can account for about 69% of the observed increase in adoption total that we get from pure effects in this model, whereas friends can account for 97% of the increase in adoption if we shut down the pure effects coming from strangers. So you see the substitutability. You also see that friends are kind of doing something a bit more than strangers in terms of their effect on the propensity to adopt. So last thing we do, once we have the model, we can evaluate some counterfactual seating, right? So the natural kind of tension to look at here is, should we seed to someone who is very likely to keep playing a lot of games, even if they don't have a lot of friends? And if they have the cosmetic equipped, then you're going to see they're going to be very visible, and they're going to induce a lot of pure effects from stranger, as they're a stranger to other people. Or you can kind of do the classic thing and seed to someone who has a lot of friends and rely on that kind of high marginal effect from friends. So yeah, our seeding strategy, we're going to kind of draw 10,000 players from this group of 250,000, and then we'll say look at the 100 most active players from those 10,000. These guys have an average play probability of about 0.77. That's their likelihood of playing when the opportunity arises, and their average number of friends about 1.5. If we give these guys 100, or if we give these 100 most active players the product in the very beginning of the cosmetic release, generate about 524 net new adoptions on average. It's a big boost. But if we give the product to the most connected players, the 100 most connected, they have a lower probability of playing, so they're going to be less visible with the product, but they have a lot more friends, and this is going to generate a lot more net new adoptions, at least with this particular network structure, which is kind of the one from the game. Okay. Compared to seeding to random players, both of these are an improvement. Right, so the seeding to active players increases by about 25%, most connected players by a lot more. So to wrap things up then, product seeding is kind of part of the story of this paper. And this paper kind of suggests that seeding active nodes can improve on random seeding, sort of more visible nodes, but it's not going to be as effective as seeding those high degree nodes. So this is kind of continued evidence that gathering that social network information, although costly, is going to be useful. And the second thing, which is kind of a nice prediction that lines up with a paper on Thursday, which is going to be about kind of designing matchmaking algorithms to induce activity on a game like this. If we can incentivize activity amongst those who've already adopted, that can also help promote product diffusion. All right, and that's all I have, so I'll take questions.
There's a question here.
Yeah, so I guess from your results, it seems like being clever about matchmaking, people who've already bought cosmetics can increase cosmetic sales. Why should I believe the matchmaker's not already doing this? Is it like open source, their matchmaking algorithm? Or?
Yeah, so at the time that we're taking the data from, 2017, 2018, they're very explicit that their matchmaking algorithm is about fairness. Why wouldn't they do it? Well, because there's other concerns at play, right? People want to feel like they're playing a fair game. And if you do something that is going to kind of twist that in some way, then you might get some disengagement, right? So fewer people playing. So that's a reason why they wouldn't do it, but they're very explicit about kind of what they're doing.
Okay, but yeah, most of the matchmaking algorithms are kind of black box, right? Like the player wouldn't necessarily know it's less. Like you know that.
Of course.
Sure that they weren't doing this, I guess, is the question.
Don't know it for sure. So what we're going to do, at least for strangers, is we kind of test. Like once we condition on our things that are what we think the matchmaking algorithm is conditioning on, then we're going to see if there's any, say, like serial correlation in your propensity to encounter a stranger as the product. So, yeah.
Please.
Will you just repeat the question so everyone gathered?
Sure.
Please.
Are there other data sets that you considered performing a similar analysis with? And if so, how do you expect or how did you observe the strength of the results here?
So the question was whether I considered other data sets and whether I think it's kind of externally valid or generalizable, the strength of the results here. Did consider other data sets. Finding kind of the product adoption decision information is hard. So do I expect this to be generalizable? That's a hard question to answer. Insofar as kind of we find evidence for a plausible mechanism, I'd say that that kind of mechanism of awareness in a very saturated microtransaction cosmetic field is, I think that's fairly plausible, but it's hard to say.
So I have a question here. So like, do you have a sense of why you get a larger effect size from friends versus stranger? Like, do you like the mechanism behind that? Like why friends are raising awareness to a larger degree, or?
Yeah, so the best that I can say for that is that, I mean, both of them seem to operate by increasing awareness. We kind of tried exhausting a lot of the peer effect and like diffusion theory models in terms of like how it operates. We're kind of left with sort of this psychological residual of a mere exposure effect. The more you interact with friends who have this, the more kind of familiar it becomes to you, the more likely you become to adopt it. That's a bit of a non-answer.
Yeah, so one theory I had is maybe there's some externality, right? So adopting iPhones or something like that, you have real externality with friends who use the same product. With many of these immortal treasures, they track certain stats, which allow you to compare with your friends in terms of how well you're doing with certain heroes. So I'm not sure whether that's the channel through which you're more likely to adopt.
Sorry, so are you saying about like the kind of the trading functionality of the immortal treasures?
No, I mean they're tracking certain statistics of how well you're doing with the hero, like how many, yeah.
Oh, I see.
So I think that might be a channel through which, because of that, like you might have this positive externality when more friends use the thing that makes you want to adopt more so than if you see a stranger using it.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on to the last talk in this session. We will